You crossed half the galaxy to laugh at a piece of lead? The question hung in the air so long that even the translators hesitated before repeating it across the vast chamber. A few delegates exchanged confused glances, then the laughter started. It spread from one side of the Galactic Weapons Evaluation Complex to the other, rolling beneath the towering glass dome like distant thunder. Representatives from more than 80 civilizations had gathered for the annual Defense Technology Summit, each bringing the finest achievements their worlds could produce. Plasma arrays shimmered behind reinforced display fields. Gravity projectors floated silently on magnetic platforms. Compact antimatter containment units glowed behind layers of transparent shielding. Every invention represented centuries of scientific progress. Then there was the human table. Colonel Nathan Brooks stood quietly beside a black hard case no larger than a carry-on suitcase. At 46, the former Marine looked more like a high school football coach than the military representative of Earth. His gray suit fit well, his posture was relaxed, and his calm blue eyes wandered across the audience as though he were waiting for a delayed flight, instead of standing before the most powerful military minds in known space. The moderator, an elderly council official with silver feathers running along his shoulders, cleared his throat. "Colonel Brooks, the floor is yours." Nathan nodded once, unlocked the case, and slowly lifted out a single brass cartridge. He placed it gently on the display table. "This," he said, "is one of humanity's oldest military technologies." The chamber remained silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then someone laughed again. A tall reptilian engineer leaned toward his microphone with an amused grin. "Excuse me, are we missing the real demonstration?" More laughter echoed through the room. Another delegate adjusted 4 pairs of glasses before squinting at the tiny object. "What is the active energy source?" Nathan answered without changing his expression. "There isn't one." A scientist from the Orion Coalition blinked twice. "No plasma. No directed particle beam. No quantum compression." Nathan smiled politely. "No," the scientist looked genuinely puzzled. "Then, what exactly am I looking at?" Nathan rested one hand beside the cartridge. "Lead." The translator repeated the word in dozens of languages. Several delegates frowned. One council member actually leaned toward another and whispered loudly enough for nearby microphones to capture it. "They crossed interstellar space to present lead?" The room erupted again. Even reporters sitting behind the observation glass struggled to hide their smiles. Cameras drifted toward Nathan, waiting for embarrassment, frustration, maybe even an angry response. Instead, he simply waited until the laughter faded on its own. He had seen this reaction before. Years earlier, foreign officers on Earth had looked at old rifles inside museums with the same polite disbelief. Technology always tempted people into believing newer automatically meant better. Human history had taught a different lesson. The moderator finally raised a hand. "Colonel Brooks, with respect, every civilization here abandoned chemically propelled projectiles centuries ago." Nathan nodded. "Most did. Your military still issues these?" "Every day." That answer silenced several conversations at once. A few engineers stopped smiling. One of them opened a tablet and quietly began searching human military records. Nathan noticed, but said nothing. "Colonel," the moderator continued carefully, "surely your government understands that kinetic ammunition is considered obsolete." Nathan looked down at the cartridge resting beneath the bright white lights. Then he looked back at the audience with the same calm expression he had worn since walking into the room. "Obsolete," he repeated softly. "That depends on whether your goal is to impress people or solve problems." No one laughed that time. The moderator studied Nathan Brooks for several long seconds before glancing toward the council panel. Whatever they had expected from the human delegation, this was clearly not it. One of the senior evaluators tapped a crystal stylus against his desk and finally broke the silence. "Colonel Brooks, perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. This summit exists to showcase technological advancement. We are evaluating innovation, not historical artifacts." Nathan nodded as if the comment had been entirely reasonable. "I understand. Then why bring something your own ancestors invented centuries ago?" Nathan rested both hands lightly on the edge of the display table. "Because our ancestors were practical people." A few quiet chuckles drifted through the chamber again, but they were weaker now. Curiosity had started replacing amusement. A four-armed engineer from the Helion Republic leaned forward. Every civilization eventually replaces primitive systems. That is how progress works. Nathan looked directly at him. Sometimes. The engineer frowned. You disagree? I think people confuse replacing something with improving it. The translator echoed his words across the room. Several delegates exchanged thoughtful looks. Nathan continued before anyone interrupted. Earth has built laser weapons. We have experimented with particle accelerators. We have tested electromagnetic launch systems. We understand energy weapons very well. One council member blinked in surprise. Then why continue manufacturing chemical firearms? Nathan smiled faintly. Because they still do the job we asked them to do. Another scientist raised a hand. Surely there must be political reasons. Economic limitations, perhaps. Nathan almost laughed, but kept his voice even. No. Our defense budget is measured in trillions of dollars. If we wanted every soldier carrying an experimental energy rifle tomorrow morning, we could begin making that transition. The chamber grew noticeably quieter. Then your military chooses not to. Correct. The moderator folded his hands. Explain. Nathan glanced down at the cartridge once more before answering. Engineers like elegant solutions. Soldiers like reliable ones. That sentence lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. An elderly researcher adjusted the translation settings on his console. Reliable in what sense? Drop it in mud. Nathan answered. Leave it in freezing weather. Carry it through a sandstorm. Put it in heavy rain. Let it sit for years in storage. When someone needs it, it still works. The engineer from Helion shook his head. Energy weapons can be hardened against environmental failure. Of course they can. Nathan agreed. But every improvement adds complexity. Complexity creates maintenance. Maintenance creates failure points. A young analyst sitting near the back quietly began typing notes. Another delegate stopped recording promotional footage and switched to a technical transcript instead. Nathan noticed the subtle changes. Nobody was laughing anymore. Colonel, the moderator asked carefully, are you suggesting humanity intentionally avoids unnecessary complexity? Nathan shrugged. Not always. We love inventing things. We just do not confuse impressive with useful. The room remained still. Then a soft voice came from the second row. It belonged to Professor Celera, one of the most respected materials scientists in the Alliance. May I ask a personal question? Nathan nodded. When you entered this room today, did you already know everyone would laugh? Nathan looked around the chamber, meeting faces that no longer seemed nearly as confident as they had 10 minutes earlier. Yes, he answered honestly. Because every generation believes the previous one was foolish. He paused before adding one final sentence. History has a habit of embarrassing people who underestimate simple ideas. No applause followed. No debate erupted. Instead, dozens of military experts quietly requested access to the next phase of the evaluation, and for the first time that morning, nobody seemed interested in the tiny cartridge because it looked primitive. They wanted to understand why the people who had mastered interstellar travel had never stopped trusting it. The council moderator stood and gestured toward a reinforced testing hall beyond the main chamber. Transparent alloy walls surrounded a long evaluation range that stretched nearly 300 yards beneath the dome. Observation decks overlooked every angle, while rows of sensors waited to record every measurable detail. Nathan Brooks picked up the single cartridge from the display table and slipped it back into the hard case before carrying a compact rifle to the firing station. It looked surprisingly ordinary. Black finish, clean lines, no glowing power cell, no cooling vents, no energy coils humming beneath the receiver. Several visitors exchanged skeptical looks. One reporter whispered into her recorder, "It looks older than half the museum exhibits on my homeworld." Professor Celera walked beside Nathan as technicians prepared the range. May I ask another question? Nathan smiled. You have been asking good ones so far. She looked at the rifle with genuine curiosity. Why does it have so many moving parts if simplicity is your goal? Nathan rested the rifle on the bench. Because every part has one job. If something eventually wears out, we replace one part instead of rebuilding the entire weapon. Celera slowly nodded while making notes. Modular. Exactly. Across the room, the Helion engineer folded his arms. This demonstration will finally settle the discussion. Nathan looked over. I hope so. Automated platforms rolled into position one after another. The first target consisted of composite alloy panels commonly used throughout civilian transport fleets. The second represented standard military armor issued across several Alliance security forces. The third carried advanced layered shielding designed to absorb directed energy weapons. Every delegate leaned forward as the range lights turned green. "Colonel Brooks," the moderator announced, "you may begin whenever you are ready." Nathan calmly loaded the rifle. The sound of the action cycling echoed softly through the otherwise silent hall. It was mechanical, almost old-fashioned, yet strangely reassuring. A few delegates instinctively glanced toward the weapon. They had expected dramatic charging sequences or warning lights. Instead, they heard steel locking into place with quiet confidence. Nathan settled into position without rushing. Years of disciplined training showed in every movement. He adjusted the stock against his shoulder, took one steady breath, and looked through the optic. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was simply doing something he had practiced thousands of times. The first shot broke the silence. It was sharp but controlled, disappearing almost instantly inside the acoustic dampening field. The first target rocked backward. Sensor lights flashed across the control panels. Engineers immediately leaned toward their monitors. "Structural penetration confirmed," one technician announced. Nobody reacted. That result had been expected. Nathan chambered another round. The second shot reached the military armor display. More sensor lights flickered. Analysts quietly compared readings while the Helion engineer frowned at his tablet. "Interesting," he muttered. "The impact profile is cleaner than predicted." Nathan remained silent. He simply waited for permission to continue. The moderator looked toward the technical review team. "Proceed." The final target slowly rotated into position. This one attracted every eye in the room. Advanced defensive materials represented decades of Alliance research, specifically engineered to resist high-energy attacks. Several delegates confidently folded their arms, expecting the demonstration to end here. Nathan took another careful breath and squeezed the trigger once more. There was no explosion, no blinding flash. Only another controlled report followed by complete silence. Every monitor paused for nearly 2 seconds before streams of diagnostic data flooded the displays. The technicians stopped talking. One removed his glasses and looked directly through the observation window, instead of trusting the instruments. Another restarted the sensor array, convinced a calibration error had occurred. Professor Celera slowly lowered her tablet. "That cannot be correct," she whispered. Nathan stood, engaged the rifle's safety, and calmly placed it back on the bench. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply waited while the room struggled to understand why the smallest and least impressive weapon presented that morning had just become the one everyone wanted to examine. Engineers flooded the testing floor before the automated systems had even finished recording the final readings. Nathan Brooks stepped away from the firing station without saying a word, giving the specialists all the room they needed. He had learned long ago that people trusted their own discoveries more than someone else's explanation. Professor Celera reached the target first. She ran a scanner slowly across the impact area, studying every microscopic detail. Her expression shifted from curiosity to genuine concentration. Behind her, the Helion engineer activated 3 different diagnostic devices, each more sophisticated than the last. Every machine returned the same conclusion: no energy residue, no exotic radiation, no unknown particles, just a remarkably clean transfer of momentum. The engineer looked up at Nathan. "There has to be something we are missing." Nathan folded his arms comfortably. "You are welcome to keep looking." Another materials expert carefully lifted the recovered projectile from a collection tray using precision tools. It had deformed exactly as human engineers intended. Professor Celera examined it beneath a magnified display. It changed shape. Nathan nodded. "Sometimes that is exactly what we want." The Helion engineer frowned. "Your projectile sacrificed its own structural integrity. It completed its job." Nathan replied, "Those are not always the same thing." Several delegates quietly gathered around the display. Their earlier confidence had completely disappeared. Instead of trying to dismiss the technology, they began asking questions the way scientists always did when they encountered something that challenged their assumptions. "How expensive is each round?" one economist asked. Nathan answered immediately. "Far less than replacing a damaged energy cell." A logistics officer looked surprised. "Production time?" "Measured in minutes, not days." Maintenance requirements. Minimal. Another engineer raised a hand. Storage life. Nathan smiled. Long enough that some ammunition manufactured decades ago can still function exactly as intended if properly stored. That answer produced another long silence. A supply commander from the Alliance Defense Bureau slowly lowered his datapad. He had spent an entire career calculating fuel costs, replacement schedules, and maintenance cycles. Suddenly, he was looking at a system that ignored many of the logistical problems every advanced military had simply accepted as unavoidable. Your weapon is not technologically superior, he said carefully. Nathan nodded. I agree. Several heads turned toward him in surprise. The commander continued. Then why does it perform so well? Nathan looked around the room before answering. Because we optimized it for reality instead of perfection. Professor Celera repeated the sentence quietly to herself. Reality instead of perfection. Nathan walked toward the examination table where the recovered projectile rested beneath bright laboratory lights. Every civilization solves problems differently. Some chase elegance. Some chase efficiency. Humans usually ask a simpler question. The moderator looked up from his notes. Which is? Nathan picked up an empty training cartridge from his case and rolled it gently across the table. Will it still work when somebody is exhausted, cold, scared, and carrying it after 3 days without proper sleep? Nobody answered. Even the journalists stopped typing. Nathan continued in the same calm voice. That question has shaped human engineering for centuries. Professor Celera looked from the cartridge to the rifle resting quietly on the firing bench. So this was never about preserving old technology. Nathan shook his head. No. It was about refusing to abandon something that kept earning its place. The Helion engineer slowly closed his scanner. Earlier that morning, he had laughed louder than anyone else. Now he extended one of his 4 hands toward Nathan. Colonel Brooks, he said sincerely, I believe we have been evaluating the wrong thing. Nathan accepted the handshake with a small smile. That happens more often than people like to admit. Around them, technicians quietly requested additional testing time, while military observers who had expected to spend only a few minutes at the human exhibit canceled the rest of their afternoon schedules without saying a word. By late afternoon, the evaluation chamber looked nothing like it had that morning. The laughter was gone. In its place came quiet conversations, technical debates, and more than a few uncomfortable expressions from delegates who had dismissed the human presentation before it even began. The moderator stepped back onto the central platform and addressed the room. The technical committee has approved one final comparative evaluation. A large holographic display illuminated behind him. At the request of multiple Alliance defense representatives, the human weapon will now be tested against current military defensive standards under controlled conditions. Nathan Brooks gave a small nod. That seems fair. Across the room, Fleet Admiral Karan of the Valyrian Defense Directorate slowly rose from his seat. Unlike the engineers, Karan had remained skeptical through every demonstration. He was a career commander, decorated across dozens of campaigns, and he had spent most of his professional life believing that energy superiority decided every battle before it began. Colonel Brooks, Karan said, your earlier tests were interesting, but they were conducted against standardized evaluation materials. Those are useful for laboratories, not battlefields. Nathan met his eyes. I agree. The Admiral seemed surprised by the answer. Then let us examine something that actually matters. A reinforced platform emerged from beneath the testing floor, carrying a section of advanced Alliance infantry armor. It was the newest generation, manufactured only 18 months earlier. Every layer had been designed to disperse heat, redirect plasma, and absorb concentrated energy impacts. Representatives from several member worlds quietly applauded as the display rotated beneath bright lights. One analyst whispered, nothing in the civilian market has ever passed completely through one of those plates. Professor Celera glanced toward Nathan. Did you know this was coming? I hoped it would. You do not seem nervous. Nathan smiled politely. If I were demonstrating something I had never tested before, I would be. Admiral Karan folded his hands behind his back. For fairness, Colonel Brooks, you may use any ammunition your delegation has legally registered for today's evaluation. Nathan opened the black case and looked inside for a moment. Instead of selecting the cartridge used earlier, he removed another one that appeared almost identical to everyone except Professor Celera. She noticed the tiny colored marking near the base. Different, she asked quietly. A different tool, Nathan answered. The Helion engineer leaned closer. Not a stronger weapon. Nathan shook his head. Different jobs required different solutions. That answer caught the attention of nearly every logistics officer in the room. They had assumed humanity relied on one basic design. Now they realized there might be an entire family of specialized ammunition built around the same platform. Nathan loaded the rifle with the same calm movements as before. No dramatic speech. No warning. He simply confirmed the range was clear and waited for authorization. The moderator nodded once. You may proceed. Nathan settled behind the rifle, took one measured breath, and fired. The report echoed softly through the chamber before disappearing into the acoustic field. Every eye immediately shifted to the armor plate. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then the diagnostic display flashed amber instead of green. Automated scanners moved across the target while technicians exchanged puzzled looks. Run the scan again, one supervisor ordered. The results returned exactly the same. A second scanner confirmed them. Then a third. Admiral Coran stepped closer, studying the numbers with growing disbelief. Those readings cannot be correct. Professor Celera looked at the display, then back toward Nathan. Colonel, she asked quietly, exactly how many different kinds of ammunition does humanity manufacture? Nathan did not answer immediately. He simply closed the rifle's action, rested it safely on the bench, and looked at the long row of delegates now waiting for his response. Enough, he said calmly. That we stopped thinking about bullets a very long time ago. We started thinking about problems instead. The request for additional testing spread through the chamber faster than any official announcement. Delegates who had planned to leave after the afternoon session quietly returned to their seats, while observers from the Alliance Defense Bureau filled every remaining space along the upper galleries. Nathan Brooks stood near the firing lane with a paper cup of coffee someone from the hospitality staff had quietly handed him during the break. He thanked her with a smile, took one sip, and watched technicians prepare the next phase without offering a single suggestion. Professor Celera walked over carrying a stack of fresh reports. You know they are rewriting their assumptions in real time. Nathan glanced toward the engineers gathered around the diagnostic tables. Good. That is why we came. She looked at him carefully. You expected resistance. I expected confidence. There is a difference. Nathan smiled. Confidence asks questions. Pride already believes it knows the answers. Before Celera could respond, Admiral Coran approached with two senior tactical analysts following behind him. His tone had changed completely from the morning session. Colonel Brooks, we would like permission to conduct one final evaluation. Nathan nodded. What kind? Not another materials test. Coran activated a holographic display between them. A detailed battlefield simulation appeared above the table, showing an urban district, supply routes, communication nodes, and mixed infantry formations. Technology rarely succeeds or fails in isolation, the Admiral explained. We want to see how your equipment performs inside an actual operational scenario. Nathan studied the map for a few seconds. Who built the simulation? Alliance Tactical Command. Nathan looked back at him. Then let your officers run it. A younger analyst seemed confused. You are not going to command the human forces? Nathan shook his head. No. If the equipment only works under perfect operators, then it is not as reliable as we claim. The room grew unexpectedly quiet. That answer caught the attention of every military instructor present. Coran slowly nodded. Very well. The simulation began. Alliance officers received full access to human equipment manuals, logistical data, and operational limits. They studied the documents for nearly 20 minutes before issuing their first movement orders. Nathan remained seated with his coffee, answering questions only when asked. He never corrected their tactics. He never interrupted their planning. Professor Celera noticed. You are letting them make mistakes. Nathan looked at the holographic city. Everybody learns faster when the lesson belongs to them. The first exercise focused on endurance. Simulated weather shifted from freezing temperatures to blowing dust before ending with heavy rain. Communication delays complicated supply deliveries while maintenance crews worked under constant time pressure. The analysts watched every variable carefully. One after another, unexpected results appeared. Human equipment required fewer specialized tools than predicted. Replacement parts were easier to transport. Training time proved shorter. Maintenance intervals stretched longer than Alliance planning models expected. None of those advantages looked dramatic by themselves. Together, they changed the entire logistical picture. A logistics commander quietly recalculated his projections 3 separate times before finally lowering his tablet. "This cannot be right," he whispered. "Their combat efficiency is improving because the support network is simpler." Another officer nodded slowly. "They are spending less time fixing equipment and more time accomplishing missions." Admiral Karan stared at the growing stream of data without saying a word. Finally, he looked toward Nathan. "You designed your weapons around the soldier instead of asking the soldier to adapt to the weapon." Nathan set down his empty coffee cup. "Exactly." Karan looked back at the simulation where human units continued operating with steady consistency despite worsening conditions. For the first time all day, nobody in the chamber was talking about lead, firearms, or old technology anymore. The discussion had become something much larger. They were beginning to understand that humanity had never built its military around impressive inventions. It had built everything around ordinary people who simply needed dependable tools when everything else started going wrong. The simulation concluded with a quiet tone instead of a celebration. No alarms flashed. No dramatic victory banner appeared across the holographic display. The final report simply listed mission completion, equipment availability, logistical efficiency, and operational readiness. Admiral Karan stood motionless, reading the numbers again before turning toward the technical committee. "Run the scenario one more time," he said. One of the analysts looked surprised. "With the same parameters?" "No," Karan folded his arms. "Increase equipment failures by 30%. Extend supply delays. Reduce visibility. I want to know where the breaking point actually is." Nathan Brooks remained seated, watching without interfering. Professor Celera noticed the faint smile on his face. "You seem pleased." Nathan shrugged. "They stopped trying to prove us wrong. What are they trying to do now? Understand why it works." The second simulation began under far harsher conditions. Weather systems shifted unpredictably. Communication blackouts interrupted coordination. Vehicle availability dropped as maintenance windows disappeared. Yet the results remained surprisingly consistent. Human equipment continued operating with only minor adjustments, while support teams adapted using standard field procedures already built into the operational manuals. A logistics officer leaned toward another and whispered, "Everything is designed to keep moving instead of waiting for perfect conditions." His colleague nodded. "That is not an accident." Professor Celera walked back to the examination table where Nathan's black equipment case still rested. "Colonel," she asked, "earlier you said different problems require different tools." Nathan stood and opened the case once more. Instead of revealing advanced prototypes or classified devices, he arranged several cartridges across the table. They looked similar at first glance, but each carried a different colored marking. "These all fit the same rifle," Celera observed. "They do, yet they are not identical." "No." Nathan pointed to the first round. "Training." Then another. "Barrier penetration." A third. "Precision shooting." Another. "Reduced noise." One more. "Specialized environments." The delegates slowly gathered around the display again. The Helion engineer counted them silently before looking up. "You built an entire system around flexibility." Nathan nodded. "We built options." Admiral Karan stepped closer. "Most Alliance militaries develop a new weapon every time a new mission appears." Nathan smiled. "Humans usually ask whether the old tool can solve the new problem with a smarter approach." That sentence settled over the room. Several procurement officials exchanged uncomfortable glances. Entire industries across the Alliance depended on designing completely new platforms every few years. Human engineers had chosen another path entirely. Improve what already worked. Refine it. Adapt it. Keep training with it until every soldier trusted it without hesitation. Professor Celera gently picked up one of the cartridges. "This is remarkably ordinary." Nathan looked at it for a moment before answering. "Most important tools are." She turned it slowly beneath the overhead lights. "I think we made the same mistake this morning." "Which one?" Nathan asked. "We judged the technology before we understood the philosophy behind it." Nathan nodded once. "That happens when people focus on appearance." Across the chamber, one of the younger Alliance cadets quietly approached the display after waiting patiently all afternoon. "Colonel Brooks," he asked, almost hesitantly, "may I ask one final question?" Nathan smiled warmly. "Of course." The cadet looked from the cartridges to the rifle and back again. When did humanity realize that dependable equipment mattered more than impressive equipment? Nathan looked thoughtful for several seconds before answering. "The day we learned that real people do not get to choose perfect circumstances." Nobody spoke after that. Even the senior commanders remained silent, because every person in the room understood the truth hidden inside that simple answer. The lesson had never been about ammunition, engineering, or manufacturing. It had always been about the people expected to rely on those tools when everything else became uncertain. As the afternoon drew toward its close, the atmosphere inside the Galactic Weapons Evaluation Complex had changed so completely that it almost felt like a different building. Early in the day, delegates had wandered from exhibit to exhibit searching for the brightest display or the most dramatic presentation. Now, nearly every conversation centered on practical questions. Supply officers spoke with engineers. Scientists compared notes with military historians. Even the reporters had stopped chasing flashy headlines and started interviewing logistics specialists instead. Nathan Brooks quietly packed several of the demonstration cartridges back into the black case, while Professor Celera reviewed a growing stack of technical requests from Alliance Research Institutes. She smiled without looking up. "You have received 32 invitations to speak before engineering academies." Nathan chuckled. "I came here to demonstrate equipment, not lecture." "I do not think they want to hear about the equipment anymore." She finally looked at him. "They want to understand how your people think." Before Nathan could answer, Admiral Karan approached carrying a single sheet of printed paper instead of his usual digital tablet. "Colonel Brooks," he said, "I have one final question before this summit concludes." Nathan closed the case and waited. Karan held up the paper. "This morning I reviewed every publicly available record on human military technology. Your civilization has developed directed energy systems, advanced drones, autonomous targeting, orbital defense networks, and experimental electromagnetic platforms. You possess the knowledge to replace conventional ammunition almost entirely." Nathan nodded. "We do." "Then why have you not done it?" The nearby conversations slowly faded as more delegates turned to listen. Nathan thought for a moment before answering. "Because replacing something only makes sense if the replacement is better for the people who depend on it." Karan frowned slightly. "Better by what measurement?" Nathan rested one hand on the equipment case. "Reliability, cost, training, maintenance, manufacturing, transportation, repair, performance under stress, ease of use, availability." He smiled politely. "Real life rarely gives us only one variable." Professor Celera folded her arms. "Our research culture celebrates technological breakthroughs. Humanity celebrates dependable results," Nathan replied. "Sometimes those two ideas overlap. Sometimes they do not." One of the younger engineers raised a hand. "So your goal has never been to build the most advanced weapon?" Nathan shook his head. "Our goal has always been to make sure the person holding it comes home if everything else falls apart." The answer lingered in the room longer than any technical explanation had that day. It was simple enough for every translator to deliver perfectly, yet powerful enough that nobody immediately responded. Finally, Admiral Karan gave a slow nod. "I believe we misunderstood your civilization." Nathan looked at him calmly. "How so?" Karan glanced around the chamber. "We believed humans relied on older systems because you had not caught up with the rest of us." He paused before continuing. "Now I think you kept them because you never forgot who they were built for." Nathan offered the slightest smile. "That is much closer." Around the hall, delegates quietly resumed their conversations, but the tone had changed once again. Nobody spoke about primitive technology anymore. They spoke about design philosophy, human decision-making, and the quiet discipline of refusing to discard something that still served its purpose. For the first time since the summit had begun, the smallest object displayed by any civilization had become the one that inspired the largest discussion, not because it was mysterious, but because it reminded an entire galaxy that true progress is measured by how well ordinary people can depend on the tools placed in their hands. The official closing session lasted less than 15 minutes. There were no dramatic speeches, no awards, and no declaration that humanity had changed the future of military science. Instead, The moderator quietly thanked every delegation for participating and announced that the Alliance Technical Review Board would be updating several engineering standards based on the findings presented during the summit. Around the chamber, representatives packed their equipment into polished containers and prepared to leave for worlds scattered across thousands of light years. Nathan Brooks latched the final lock on his black case and slipped it into his hand as though it weighed almost nothing. Professor Celera walked beside him toward the exit corridor. "Do you ever become frustrated?" she asked. Nathan glanced over. "About what?" "About always having to explain yourselves." He smiled thoughtfully. "Not really." "Why not?" "Because understanding takes longer than first impressions." They stepped into the wide observation hall overlooking the city below. Countless ships crossed the evening sky while the setting sun reflected across the glass towers surrounding the complex. Admiral Coron caught up with them just before they reached the elevator. In his hand was the same small training cartridge Nathan had placed on the table that morning. "Your staff forgot this," he said. Nathan looked at it and gently shook his head. "No, that one was meant to stay." Coron studied the simple piece of metal resting in his palm. "I think I understand now." Nathan waited without interrupting. "This is not important because it is made of lead," the Admiral said quietly. "It is important because it reminds your people never to mistake simplicity for weakness." Nathan's smile widened just enough to show he respected the conclusion. "That is a lesson worth remembering." Coron carefully placed the cartridge inside his uniform pocket instead of returning it. "I believe I will keep it on my desk. Then it will continue doing its job." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Nathan stepped inside, nodded politely to both of them, and pressed the lobby button. As the doors slowly closed, Professor Celera called out one final question. "Colonel Brooks, if you could leave the Alliance with only one piece of advice, what would it be?" Nathan looked back through the narrowing opening. "Do not build tools that impress people." He paused for just a moment before finishing. "Build tools that people can trust." The doors closed. Neither Celera nor Coron spoke during the long ride down in the neighboring elevator. Hours later, after the delegates had departed and the lights inside the exhibition hall had dimmed, maintenance crews found one unusual request waiting in the official archive. The human display was not to be remembered as an exhibit about ammunition or weapons. It was to be preserved as a case study in practical engineering and human design philosophy. Years afterward, new cadets from dozens of worlds would visit that same hall. Most of them would stop in front of a tiny brass cartridge resting beneath clear glass and wonder why such an ordinary object occupied such an important place in Alliance history. Their instructors would always give the same answer. Civilizations become stronger when they stop asking what looks powerful and start asking what helps ordinary people when life becomes difficult. Long after the technical reports became outdated and newer inventions filled the galaxy, that quiet lesson remained. Because the smallest ideas are often the ones that carry the greatest weight, and the wisest people are usually the ones who never forget who they are building the future for.